Welcome to Storm the Gates, friends. This is your official podcast for the Mid-Texas Conference of the Global Methodist Church. Your host here, Shay Ryenga, and Dr. Jason Staples. The idea of Israel in Second Temple Judaism, Paul and the resurrection of Israel. Who is Israel? We aren't even going to get to scratch the surface to answer that question, but if anyone can answer that question, Dr. Jason Staples can come closest to it. He's written two amazing academic works, so I submit those to you, encourage you to check those out. I've included his website, just jasonstaples.com, in the show notes to explore his articles and books and other videos and interests. He's a man of many talents, and one of the things that interests him and interests me is that question of who is Israel. And his work really helps the church understand it is a contested question, and that no matter where we ask that question in biblical history, it is a contested, much more complicated question to answer than we sometimes think. And so that's the subject matter of our conversation, and I think it's very consequential and important, his work, for a time such as this and sort of our American church culture and what's in the air and cultural Christianity in America. I think has tended to answer that question very simply, like, well, it must be, I read Israel in the Bible, so it must be the nation state of Israel. And it's not that simple to answer that question. And so it's much, much, much more complicated. And I hope you'll check out Dr. Jason Staples' work. We're grateful for his time sharing with us, as he is assistant teaching professor at NC State University in the Philosophy and Religious Studies Department. Let's listen to Jason Staples. A little bit of what inspired you and some of your backstory that's led you to here.
Yeah, it's interesting because depending on how far back you go, there could be a lot of different inflection points in this. I mean, if you want to go back to the origins of the specific subject material that I've spent the bulk of the last 20 years on, that really goes back to a particular class in my undergrad at Florida State with he was in his final semester as a PhD candidate teaching an upper level class on the prophets. Bill Lyons was teaching a class on the prophets. And part of that class was doing a deep dive into one prophet for a term paper. And, back in those days, we didn't just feed things into LLMs to have the term paper write for us and all that. So, I had to actually spend a lot of time, getting familiar with Jeremiah in particular. And there were a few things that stood out. One was, I remember there was a book by Gordon McConville. It's one of the books for that class at Florida State was the Exploring the Old Testament volume on the prophets by Gordon McConville. That's the IVP little volume. And those are actually pretty good volumes for introductions to different parts of the Bible. And that one on the prophets by McConville is actually especially good. But there were a couple points in there that really caught my attention in that class while I was reading that book and going through. And one of them was McConville observing that, like in Isaiah, in 2nd Isaiah in particular, so the chapters of Isaiah that were likely written after the Babylonian exile, where they're talking about Jacob and Israel as a whole and so on. And McConville just sort of wonders aloud, like, well, I mean, considering he's writing from a perspective of Judah after the Babylonian exile, and the Israel, as in the northern kingdom, has basically not been around for close to 200 years by this point. One wonders what exactly what Israel he has in mind here. Like, how does the prophet define this? I don't remember the exact wording of it, but that stood out to me. It was like, I'd never thought about that. And then I spent some time working through Jeremiah, and after having read that part in Isaiah, and then there were a couple other comments similar to that in his analysis of Jeremiah, but reading through Jeremiah, I was like, man, Jeremiah has a bunch of stuff about Ephraim and, prophesy to the north in Jeremiah 3, because, Judah has made northern Israel look good by comparison. Treacherous Judah has made faithless Israel look, has made her look good. So I will redeem them too, prophesy to the north, Jeremiah. And then the book of consolation has, these promises to the house of Israel and the house of Judah. And so I started noticing these things and then realizing that like the new covenant prophecy in Jeremiah 31, that's cited directly. It's quoted in the New Testament. It's alluded to a variety of different times. And in Jeremiah, it's about the reunification of the two houses of Israel and return from exile and, all of that. And that's what the change of heart and the law written on the heart and all that is really aiming toward. And I started going like, what in the world is going, like, why are the New Testament authors reading it this way? Why? And so that really began the thread that I had to pull out. And it took me, the better part of 4 or 5 years to really feel like I had a handle on it. It was probably 2008 or so when I really felt like, or 2006 or so. So that was 2003 when I took that class. It was about 2006 when I started to feel like I had a decent handle on it as far as how that was working in the New Testament and in some early Jewish material after that. And then it was just a matter of pulling out the thread of going, okay, is this out of nowhere? Or like, what trajectory is this coming from? Like, where is this coming from? And that was really the bulk of the last 2 decades. So that's probably the chief inflection point, at least on the scholarly side. I mean, there were lots of other inflection points as well, but that sort of began that part of the journey, as it were.
Okay. Your work is so interesting for me, and I want to highlight, your website because that's a wonderful hub that has sort of all your books and articles that are easily accessible for folks. But your 2 massive works, The Idea of Israel and Second Temple Judaism, Paul and the Resurrection of Israel, kind of a part 1, part 2. Just want to highlight that. I've encouraged a lot of friends to engage with your work over the years. For me, I remember, so like you mentioned a class that you had. I've been fascinated by this who is Israel question, I think, starting with Charles Talbert. I took an undergraduate class at Baylor by Charles Talbert in apocalyptic literature. And for that, we had to read from a Baptist perspective this book on kind of being critical of the Left Behind series, and then tracing the historical dispensationalism of Darby and coming. And for me as a little undergraduate student, I guess I grew up in the church. I grew up in a Methodist church. I'm a mutt. Aren't we all? I want to ask you a question about aren't we all mutts to get at this ethnicity stuff. But I'm a bit of a mutt in that I'm a charismatic Baptist. I have formative experiences in the charismatic and Baptist context, but I'm born and raised Methodist in the Global Methodist Church now. And so this question's always been interesting because I've digested so much of dispensationalism over the years. I've never been a dispensationalist. In fact, I think your work is so important right now for a time such as this because so much of the political leadership in America is, I think, held captive by certain dispensationalist views. And I just think your work is so helpful to have a sober, actually biblical view of answering this question, who is Israel? So that's a long setup, a little bit of my backstory and why I've not ever up until encountering your work really been able to hear a compelling argument from Scripture to answer the question, who is Israel? So to get into that, who is Israel, depending on where we're talking about in Scripture, whether it's the Second Temple period, before then, after then, I'd love to get into that by asking you to maybe comment on God's providence, because it's taken you said almost 20 years to work on what became those 2 significant works. And I don't feel like that time is at all accidental that we have your 2 books now for the church, for our cultural political moment. And so do you want to comment on any of that?
Well, I could talk for too long on some of that. Actually, I should talk for too long on a lot of things, but it's funny that you mentioned the Left Behind stuff and all of that, because before that class on the prophets, I had before I was a religious studies major at Florida State. I went to Florida State actually first of all to play football, and then second after that potentially to go pre-med. And the one thing I knew I wasn't going to do was anything having to do with religion or theology or anything like that. That was the one thing I was pretty confident of. Uh,
Okay.
but I also had gotten super frustrated by the popularity of the Left Behind series among certain people that I knew. And, I'd been raised in a context to be very, to be very much a critical thinker across the board, and to, with subjects like that, to evaluate as sort of dispassionately as possible. But I thought the whole thing was very frustrating. And so the one of the things that I was doing as of, this would have been '01. So another year and a half prior to that '03 prophets class, which was spring of '03. In '01, I was doing the sorts of debates and things that one does with one's college friends and those sorts of things. And I got finally so frustrated with some of this, and I was like, somebody has to write a decent book basically debunking all this Left Behind nonsense. So I began a project as a, late freshman, early sophomore in college, called Will You Be Left Behind? And I was
Wow.
doing a deep dive on all of that stuff. Like, okay, we're gonna get to the bottom of all this, and debunk some of this stuff once and for all, because this is just nonsense. It doesn't work. And I knew that, the history with Darby and so on as well. But one of the things that I ran into is I went to the office. So there are certain things in terms of Greek interpretation that I discovered very quickly. Like, I'm dependent on what this or that commentator says this means. And I'm not sure, and it was actually a passage in 2 Thessalonians 2, which is actually really difficult, really complicated Greek, among the most difficult and frustratingly ambiguous parts of the New Testament. And it's like, what in the world is this? Like, and he will not, and now you know what is holding him or it back until he or it is taken out of the gidnomai ekmesa. I don't know what this means. So I looked up. I was like, well, there's bound to be somebody here on faculty who knows, who can help me with this. So I, looked up in the faculty directory, looked up David Levinson. He was one of the New Testament faculty, or he was the only really New Testament early Christianity faculty member there at the time. And set up a meeting, sent him an email and said, hey, I'm working on this project on this, wanted to know if you could help me out. So we go to his office and we start working through it, and he's looking at me doing it and telling me this. And then it occurs to him, like, because I'm tracking with him on all sorts of stuff. And then we start doing some stuff, and he looks at me and he goes, wait a second, you don't know Greek at all, do you? It's like, no, that's why I'm here. And he's like, you just need to learn Greek. There's a Greek class starting. We've got a two semester 1 and 2 in our classics department. We got one of the best classics departments in the world. Just sign up for Greek 1 next fall. Get yourself started here. If this is the sort of thing you're interested in, you ought to do that, and at least give yourself a chance to be able to know some of these things more firsthand, because, I can help you with some of this, but like, you got to be able to do this yourself. So that started that journey to some degree already at that point. And then I ended up taking a Matthew class, a seminar with him, I think the next year as well, and eventually shifted my major, ended up doing a bunch in religion and classics, and took 8 languages or whatever, 9 languages before I left Florida State. That completely shifted where I was going. So a lot of this goes back to that. And so in some sense I was primed to think about some of these questions, probably, or most assuredly by that kind of early interest and frustration, that then when I started doing real serious work and started coming across the things like what Gordon McConville had said, and those, and looking at what's going on in Jeremiah and realizing like these are difficult questions, then that sort of opened the door for me to try to again, pull on the thread to give more robust answers to some of these very difficult questions.
That's awesome. So to the extent that without getting granular in the weeds of just all the work that you've already done, how would you characterize simply answering that question, who is Israel, in the different epochs or timelines? Even though I'm not a dispensationalist, sometimes I still find some utility in using the word to demarcate certain time before, like, first temple versus second temple versus, these different periods. So how would you, from the geography of Genesis and the promise of Abraham to some of these different periods, is there a simple way that you like to sort of explain it, or it's impossible because it does get
Well,
so tricky and complex historically?
I'm laughing because I've started working on the audiobook for Idea of Israel, and
Okay.
going back through that. I mean, the first chapter, one of the points of emphasis is that the identification or status of Israel, who constitutes Israel, is specifically a point of debate through all of those time periods,
All of
right?
them. Yeah.
Right. So,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
this is being a part of the people of Israel is a way of designating and demarcating oneself as a member of the special covenant with the high God, right?
Yeah.
So, with the highest God. So, you know, who gets to be a part of that club and a part of that team and, a part of that people? This is precisely the kind of question that is debated throughout. And to sort of put flesh on it, if you go to Ezra and Nehemiah, they're having that debate, right? Like, no, you can't marry them because they're not Israelites. And if you marry them, then your children won't count. But guess what? Ezra and Nehemiah appear to be in the minority in that judgment, right? There are
Mm.
lots of other people, including the priestly leadership, who are going, yeah. You can marry them. They can come in, and then your children and their children, they are Israelites. They're being engrafted into Israel. And Ezra and Nehemiah are going, no, they're not. You are leaving Israel by doing so. And so, do the Samaritans count as Israelites or not? The Samaritans certainly thought they did and
Right.
argued that they had the pedigree, that they ought to be considered that way. And in fact, the Samaritan argument against the Jews, the people from Judah, was, you all are a bunch of separatists who illegitimately took the Ark of the Covenant from where God wanted it to begin with, and then took it down to this place of idolatry in Jerusalem. And we should be worshiping where everybody was worshiping before David. So let's go back to the old ways. We're the Orthodox,
Wow.
orthopraxis people. We are the real Israelites, and you all are a bunch of apostates who've been going the wrong direction ever since David. And they're claiming that they're Israel on those grounds. Whereas Jews in the same time period, in the Second Temple period, when a lot of these debates are happening, are saying, yeah, you Samaritans, you illegitimately, and you can see this view in First and Second Kings, for example, you illegitimately rejected the divinely selected authority over Israel. Now, granted, God chose that you would break off, and that was his will for you to break off. So you're not entirely cut off in that respect. But ultimately, David and his seed and Jerusalem are where God chose to put his name and who God chose to lead his people. And if you want to be legitimate, then you need to get back on board and join in under the rightly, and join in the right location where God has chosen to put his name forever. And ultimately, we need to wait for the rightful seed of David to take back over in terms of kingdom. And we need to have the right sons of Aaron, in charge of the priesthood here in Jerusalem, because up there, they may have been doing stuff before David, but the fact of the matter is that, in all the high places where they were doing stuff,
Right.
what they were doing up there, and it wasn't all our God stuff. So
Right.
we're the right ones. So this is a long-standing debate that goes, I mean, if you really want to take this back into the biblical period, this is going back at least to Jeroboam and Rehoboam. And if you want to be a careful reader, it's going back before that, because if you look
Right.
at during David's career, when Avshalom takes over, he wins over, it says, the hearts of the people of Israel, right? He camps out by the gate of Jerusalem and he calls out and he says, "Oh, from where, where are you coming from?" And it says, and when someone had said, "Oh, your servant is from such and so of the tribes of Israel,"
Mm.
then Avshalom would say, "Oh, if only we had somebody to judge fairly for you." And the distinction there is Israel versus Judah. And he's playing on that fracture that's already there in David's time. And then when Avshalom dies and David crosses over and the people from Judah help him across, the people from Israel are all ticked off about this. They say, "We have 10 shares in David and you only have one. Well, we should have come and done this." And they almost come to blows again. And so you have, Tivni that goes in, and you have another, attempted coup based on this northern fracture. So all the way back to David, at least, you're
Wow.
having these, at least in the biblical record, these debates over who counts as a part of the people of Israel, what kind of unity there ought to be, where and how God, the God of Israel, ought to be worshipped. And this is a 3,000-year-old debate if we're going to look at the biblical record on it. And by the time you get to the New Testament, the earliest Christians are absolutely participating in exactly the same debate. They're
Wow.
participating and they're making the claim that if you want to be following the God of Israel correctly, what does Jesus say in the Gospel of John? He's talking, not coincidentally, to a Samaritan woman who brings up the question of, we worship
Yes.
God in this mountain, but you guys worship down in Jerusalem. What do you say? And Jesus says, well, the time has come, and the time is coming, and already is, when the worshipers of God will worship in spirit and in truth. And it's not about this or that mountain, but rather obedience to the God of Israel, and specifically obedience through Jesus himself. And that's the
Right.
claim that the earliest Christians ultimately make, is they basically say, okay, look, we're going to settle the problem. It's not Jerusalem or Gerizim. It's not Samaritans or Jews. It's not, in fact, all of the promises are wrapped up in the one person, Jesus, who is the prophet like Moses, who is the seed of David, who has been raised up as promised. And now we have to listen to him and follow by the Spirit that he has given. And then from that point forward, the earliest Christian claim is that although there are other Israelites, in order to be an Israelite or a member of Israel in good standing in terms of full participation in the covenant as God has designed, then you need to follow Jesus and have the Spirit. And so that's the basic claim.
Yeah. And in following Jesus and having the Spirit as the basic claim, then, I mean, to me, what you said is so scriptural, consistent. It's difficult, and so to me, current residents of the nation state of Israel today would not be Israel in that sense, based on that claim, right?
Well, I don't think we can say that with quite so much, first of all, authority, and second of all, comprehensiveness.
Okay.
Because one of the things you have to remember, the modern nation state of Israel is only about 74% Jewish, non-Christian Jewish. And actually, even
Yeah.
that's a little bit misleading, because some of the people who identify as Jewish in those census data that they have are, in fact, Messianic Jews.
Okay.
So, and you got to remember, 24 to 26%, somewhere in there, is about a quarter of the population of the modern nation state of Israel is non-Jewish, Arab, Christian, or Druze
Right.
population.
Okay. Right.
This is often not understood, right?
Yeah.
And that sort of cuts with a double edge when you start asking this kind of question, because one thing that I think a lot of, particularly conservative leaning Christians in the United States sort of presume is that the modern nation state of Israel is basically a completely Jewish state. Like, to be a citizen of Israel, you are Jewish.
Right.
And it is the full restoration of the people of Israel as such in this place of the land, and it should be identified with the promises to restore the people to the land. And the realities, so first of all, the reality of just the demographics demonstrate that that's not actually the case. And secondly, politically speaking and religiously speaking, the Jews who are Israeli citizens do not and have never presented themselves as that. The modern nation state of Israel is a secular nation state. Now, it has close ties to the Hebrew or to the rabbinic, to the high rabbinic council that has say over specific religious affairs pertaining to Jews in the state of Israel, and then therefore, has spillover effects to the diaspora as well. But that, from the Orthodox Jewish perspective, it's very clear that this should not be identified as, the fulfillment of the promises to restore Israel in the end. They don't think that. So yeah, I mean, I think once you have that, and once you understand that, then that on the one hand means you can't just one-to-one identify and say, oh, modern Israeli citizen equals yeah. So
but the Jewish High Council, so the makeup of Israel is a secular state. Of course, the demographics religiously, it's complicated. So speaking of Jews who identify as Jews religiously, culturally, yet do not accept Jesus as Messiah, is that enough qualifiers to sort of say yay or nay on whether or not they're connected to biblical Israel of the new covenant?
Well, and so I think so. Yes, in one respect, and again, this is why this gets so complicated, is because none of these answers are quite so clearly, easily yes and no. Because on the one hand, Paul talks about this in Romans 9. He says, not all who are ek Israel, not all who are descended from Israel, are Israel. Fine, okay. But then he concludes in Romans 11 with respect to those who are unbelieving, and he says, with respect to the gospel, they are enemies, but they remain beloved for the sake of the patriarchs. And my reading on this is that Paul understands even unbelieving Jews. So even those who gave him a great amount of grief for following Jesus,
Right.
He understands them as still part of the people that God has chosen in some sense, that they are still elect. But Paul also does not believe that election equals assurance of final salvation.
Yeah.
And so this is where Paul says elsewhere, be careful not to judge anything before the end, right? Making final judgments about, who is in and who is out and who's got what fate or whatever. That is not something that we can really do. So in one sense, you have a situation where you have members of Israel who in the end are not going to be a part of the final restored people of Israel. And then other people who were not previously members of Israel who will be, or already are in some cases, but others who will be, who are not Israel yet, who will be Israel in the future. And so, the answer to that is that it's not so cut and dry, that in one sense, he wants to emphasize, they're not a part of the new covenant, but that doesn't mean that there's no covenantal connection either.
Okay.
Right. And so that's one of the things that I want to really emphasize, is that we have to learn to hold that tension in tension. We have to be willing to sit with that and say, well, geez, okay, that's uncomfortable, because I would like it to, if it was as easy as just everybody kind of, metaphorically speaking, could just hold up their passport and say, okay, I'm in, and here's my citizenship evidence. But that's just not the way that it works at any point in the New Testament, and it's not the way that it works at any point through this history.
Yeah. I love one of the main key, I think, points that you really drive at, and it's illuminating through the way that you've studied the scripture and explained it so thoroughly. It's, again, getting at the complexity of the question, and it's just complex, it's hard, and especially depends on when we're talking about it, but this idea that Israel, especially in the Second Temple period and onward, being scattered, diaspora to the nations. And so, in some sense, when we say Second Temple Judaism period of the question around who is Israel, are they closer to being among the nations? And this idea of the nations and Israel seem a lot closer in relationship than any other cleaner definitions. Is part of why Paul is inspired and motivated to go to the nations because, of course, Israel's been scattered among the nations in addition to the new covenant and the invitation of the promise to all people.
Yeah, I think yes, he I think is very much motivated to go to the nations precisely because he believes that Israel has been scattered among the nations
Yeah.
in this
Yeah.
particular way. This is a reclamation and restoration project for him.
Right. Okay.
But he also recognizes the connection between that and the larger promise to Abraham that in your seed all nations of the earth will be blessed. And he thinks
Yeah.
that this is God's way of basically solving all the problems in one move. So yeah, he's motivated to do that.
Okay.
He's absolutely going that direction. Now, that said, what he's not doing is essentially arguing, okay, I'm going out there and I'm somehow through my preaching identifying the people who are genetically, they have one drop of Israel, former Israelite blood or something like that, that this is, that kind of program. I don't see him, he's not a British Israelite or, Hebrew is, black Hebrew Israelite, person who's imagining things in that way. What he sees is that Israel became nothing as was
Mm.
promised, and now from nothing God is restoring Israel, and that's a very different thing. That God is just like he did with Abraham in the first place. He's calling his people out from from being not his people, and that this is actually how that restoration and reconciliation is happening. And that's something for us modern folks that I think can be hard for us to get our heads around because we would want something that's a little cleaner than that. But there is an
Yeah.
elegance to it, I think, for once you see it from kind of from his angle.
So how would you differentiate and define a definition of Israel? Who is Israel post temple now, di- different from the church?
Okay, well, that's a little tricky too, because what do you mean by church? Because
Yeah,
church
yeah,
is
you're
just
right.
a translation of the word
That's fair.
ecclesia, right?
Fair. Yeah,
And
yeah, yeah.
ecclesia is just the Greek translation of edat or kahal
Yeah.
in Hebrew, and these are words for the full assembly of the people of Israel. So it's like
Okay.
asking,
Oh, okay. That's helpful.
uh,
Thank you. Yeah.
what's the difference? What's the difference between we'll say the House of Representatives and the Senate and
Hmm.
Congress?
Okay.
Well, I mean, they're different words, and they do describe a little bit differently, but they they they're very much overlapping in that respect. That these are terms. When you see the term ecclesia, there's a good article by Jen Ale on this.
Okay.
When you see the word ecclesia in the Torah or in prior early Jewish literature, it's pretty consistently the place that it's echoing back to is the time of the 12 tribes in the wilderness with Moses, when you have the congregation of Israel that is gathered together.
Yeah.
And so then you have with the Dead Sea Scrolls folks, they use edat and kahal a little bit. They tend to prefer yachad, which just means the union, right?
Okay.
And it goes back to Hina Matovo Manayim Shevet Achim Gam Yachad, how good and wonderful, or how good and wonderful it is when brothers live together in unity. And so they call themselves the Yachad. that this is the unity that they're coming forward to, and this is about the reunification of the people of Israel, and that's what they see themselves as. The word for church is assembly. This is the essentially reunified, restored assembly, akin to that was there with Moses. So it's something
Yeah.
like that.
Okay. Why? What one of the things that I'm just a big believer in terms of like trying to help clergy colleagues. I'm a local church pastor, so the way I have these conversations, the description of the question of Israel as it relates to books like Revelation and Daniel and some of the passages. I don't know if it's just because it's been so much part of. Well, I guess my question is trying to think of how to ask it. Like, what do you think's at the heart of why so many, I'll say, influential Christian leaders, whether they're formally in the church or political or what have you, operate from a very simplistic, reductive, literalist kind of definition of Israel as it relates to the current nation state of Israel as the catalyst for all things end times and God's will for the end of things. Like, why do you think there's so much that's still so prevalent? I used to think it was just boomers and above. I think some of it's generational, but I'm surprised more and more of how many younger influential pastors that have massive platforms will just switch and talk very deep exegetically about certain passages, and then will just flip without a breath and blinking and talk about how because this peace treaty was recently signed with Iran, they're looking for the Antichrist. It
I think
mystifies me, and
the
can you help me
main
understand how that we still have so much of that?
I think the main causes of that are, first and foremost, the Bible is, in order to read the Bible as a biblically literate person, you have to have a certain baseline level of history
Yeah.
and context that the Bible presumes you have. The Bible's not written to 20th and 21st century people.
Right.
And so already you're at a disadvantage once you're talking about that. And then when you start to get into things like the term Israel is everywhere throughout the Bible, right? I mean, it's the people. These are the people that God has made this covenant with.
Yeah.
And then it's just really, really easy to, when you see Israel on your pages and then you open up your newspaper and you see
Right.
Israel, to go,
1-to-1. Yeah.
This is the difficulty about language in general. And that is, the King James Version says, suffer the little children, right?
Yep.
We would not say that way in the
Right.
21st century. Like,
Yeah.
we don't talk like that. That's not normal turn of phrase. Words change definition, change scope. Groups that are referred to by one word or another shift over time. So if you think about it this way, 80 years ago, Italian Americans weren't really regarded as white. If you talk about someone who's white
Mm.
in America, like that's incoherent to most people alive today, like, who have no recollection of that. It's like, wait, what? They're obviously white. Well,
Yeah.
that term has a whole lot of political and racist freight that goes with it, right? And in a lot of the same ways, you have terms like Israel that they're used. This is a contested word that has specific references in each place where it's used. And if you aren't attuned to that, it's just really easy to miss. And so that's part of it. And then the final part of it is, quite frankly, most 21st and also most 20th century Christians are effectively biblically illiterate when it comes to understanding their Old Testament and
Yeah.
understanding Judaism in any sort of way. So If you asked most Christians to explain how Judaism works, whether that's modern Judaism, whether that's the Judaism of Jesus' day or whatever, what they would give you would be an absolutely and thoroughly horrifying caricature that looks very little like what Jewish theology or praxis looks like at all. And then secondly, if you asked the standard, and I don't just mean the person in the pew, if you asked a pastor who's been to just a typical denominational div school of some sort,
Yeah.
explain to me the purity laws of Leviticus. What's going on with the purity laws? Explain to me how sacrifice works. What you would get would be completely detached and completely different from the actual biblical explanations of these things and the biblical sort of system of this. The fact of the matter is that there is a lot of biblical illiteracy when it comes to the Torah and when it comes to ancient Israelite and Jewish history. And so then when you don't have that foundation and then you try to read forward with things that presume you have that foundation, you're just going to miss
Yeah.
stuff. And
Yeah.
that's the hard part. And really that's where my hope is, that over the next 5 to 10 years and beyond, however long we're talking, that we're going to see enough resources able to get into the hands of pastors and interested lay people that can help bridge that gap, so that it's like so that when people open these things up, that they don't read the word Leviticus and just roll their eyes and go, okay, thank God that's no longer something we have to worry about. But they go,
Right.
oh yeah, there's a bunch of cool stuff in there, and here's how it works. I mean, I
Yeah.
think of like the work of Paul Sloan with Jesus and the Jewish law. That is a really, really important book to help explain a lot of the things that are just taken for granted in the Gospels. And if you don't
Yeah.
understand those things, you're just going to miss a lot of things. And so, I'm hoping to put some things out in addition to the scholarly stuff. There's, more resources available from the Bible Project. I think they've done some pretty good work in a lot of this area, in a lot of these areas,
Yeah.
to really build out that biblical understanding of the Old Testament, of the Hebrew Bible, and of early Judaism, and of how Jewish theology and how ancient Israelite theology works, so that people better understand what's happening in other contexts.
I love that. You mentioned Paul Sloan. I'm thinking about that is before you mentioned his name, and that was a little bit of a paradigm shift for me. Just I wasn't taught the law grace relationship quite that way, and what he's getting at in that book. Is there any overlap with his work and yours?
Oh yeah, there's definitely. I mean,
Okay.
there's definitely quite a bit. If you
Yeah.
read his book and you read that first chapter, which is on
Yeah.
restoration eschatology, I mean, he and I
Yes.
are very much moving in very much the same direction and understanding
Okay.
that as a foundational piece. And he and I understand the purity laws and the general ins and outs of Jewish theology and, Second Temple Judaism very, very similarly. There are some
Okay.
places where we have some subtle differences, and there are a few places where he and I've talked back and forth about hammering some stuff out, because he's not sure he agrees with me on this or that. And there's places where I think I probably disagree with him on some things. And it's usually on, once you get to Acts and Paul, that we have some places where we're not 100% in agreement, but you're never going to get two people that are 100% in agreement, I don't think. But
Yeah.
we're very
Yeah.
much part of what I would call a similar way of seeing how all these pieces fit together. And so, we're fellow travelers on, at least parallel roads, I would say.
Are you excited? You mentioned the audiobook and some more not quite as academic work. What's on the horizon for you that you're excited to continue exploring?
There's there's a lot. So I'm
A
under
lot.
contract right now for a commentary on the book of Romans in uh
Ooh.
the Old Testament Eyes series. So far,
Wow.
I'm looking up at a few
Okay.
of the volumes that have been done for that series. So you've got Mark, Matthew, and John. I know have been done. I think there's one or two others that have been done since then. but I'm doing the Romans volume for the Through Old Testament Eyes commentary series. And it's a short commentary designed for people in the pews and for interested clergy and folks like that. So I'm scheduled to be finishing that end of next summer. We'll see if I actually hit my deadline on that. That's, a lot to finish, but I'm excited to get that out once it's out. Again, the launch is the hope for launch is sometime maybe early 2028.
Yep.
And then I've got, the two audiobooks that I'm working on over the course of the summer and hoping to get those out in the fall. And then I've got a bunch of other projects in the works. I mean, in terms of book projects, I also have a book on C.S. Lewis and his
What?
use and understanding of scripture that's about half, maybe 55-60% done. I'm hoping to have that release as well by, maybe 2028. And then I've got a couple other popular level projects that I'm, in terms of sort of explaining to an interested layperson and some clergy as well, what's going on in my two big books, trying to sort of not dumb those down at all, but to distill a lot of what's in there without a lot of the intramural scholarly discourse to explain that. My way of thinking about it is essentially, for those popular explanations, I want someone who's a smart fifth or sixth grader to be able to pick up what I'm writing for those and be able to explain and be able to understand those. So I'm excited about all that. And then there's
I'm a big C.S.
there's a
Lewis
bunch of
fan.
others who are doing this stuff.
That's awesome. What in particular is at the heart of, is it C.S. Lewis's hermeneutic? The C.S. Lewis in the Bible, C.S. Lewis in Scripture. What are you chasing, and what's your? I don't know if it. I don't want you to disclose too much. Obviously, you're in the middle of writing it, but just kind of the general project there.
It's a little bit of a book of essays on Lewis
Okay.
and his use of scriptures and his use of scripture. So it ranges from discussions about how Lewis coming to a particular understanding of the central chapters of Romans turned out to be very influential in his own conversion.
Okay.
And tracing that through the notes that he left behind in his copy of actually a book by Matthew Arnold called St. Paul and Protestantism. And I dated the handwriting in that to about 1930, which was when he was, right in the process of sort of becoming a theist, and then shortly thereafter a Christian. And those notes and some of the things that he is pulling on in that book, I think, are a lot more influential than has been recognized. So I've got some on that. I've got some stuff on how he's leveraging or interpreting scripture in some of his fiction. So I've got a chapter on how he's doing very sophisticated exegesis of the central chapters of Romans in the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and how he actually is doing very good, it turns out, exegesis in the way that he's putting this together. And he leaves lots of little signposts and clues to how he's sort of re-mythologizing that material. Then I've got some material that I'm doing on Till We Have Faces and his depiction of holiness and essentially how he, in a lot of ways, he's trying in Till We Have Faces to rectify a problem that he identifies in reflections on the Psalms with a lot of modern Christian theology, and that's that that a lot of modern Christian theologizing is very philosophically sophisticated and robust, but that it's water and it's missing the blood aspect of what is the holy. And without that, you don't really fully understand God. So I'm going to be, I've got a full chapter on that and that aspect of Till We Have Faces. I've got one other thing I'm playing with potentially. So I don't know if you're familiar with his essay Reflections in a Tool Shed, Meditations in a Tool Shed. And in that he differentiates between two types of sight. One is looking at the beam of light from the side so that you're studying the beam, and then the other is looking along the beam so that the beam actually is what you see by. So it's, looking at versus looking along and seeing by. And in this chapter, I'm looking at, I'm not entirely sure I'm gonna run with this chapter, but I've played with it a little bit, and I've got a draft going on this of looking at a third way of seeing that Lewis actually puts forward in a couple of his fictional pieces as well, which is seeing through, and that this
Wow.
is the worst kind of the whole thing, that you end up looking through the beam and acting as though there's no light there at all. And so, in the one hand, at least if you're
Wow.
looking at, you get some kind of knowledge. If you look along, you get another kind of knowledge. If you see through it, then you actually may miss the whole thing. And so, there's another piece of that. There's several other chapters that I've got kind of going here, and I'm juggling. I may end up splitting it into a second book if some things end up, working together a little bit differently. I also have another chapter on the notes that he left behind in his Bibles and, Psalter and his New Testament and so on, and what it tells us about how he read.
Wow.
And, that chapter in particular, I'm sort of reframing right now in the way that I'm wanting to tell it, about how Lewis demonstrates how to read the Bible and remain a Christian. That he reads
Okay.
in a particular way that he then also talks about some in his letters as well. And you can see this in how in the kind of notes and things that he leaves behind. And so I want to talk some about his hermeneutic and his method for reading as well. So there's a lot there, but this was sort of my palate
Woo.
cleanser project
Wow.
after doing the 20 years on the
Okay.
others. That I've had a little bit of
Wow.
fun with. I've unfortunately not been able to focus on nearly as much as I've wanted, because I've taught so much and I've had so many other projects and deadlines. But once I get through most of this Romans commentary, then the Lewis book takes the center stage for a little bit.
I am super pumped about that book. I will be purchasing it very quickly when it's available. Uh, that is exciting. Are there you definitely identified a big problem in our church and our culture when it comes to biblical illiteracy at the foundation of some of why we are where we are. Is there any other needs? Your work obviously is clearly meeting that need and addressing that problem head on. You can't, I mean, digest your work, and I'm sure you're teaching as a teacher, as a professor, you're hitting that problem head on with the biblical illiteracy piece and challenging students to digest scripture. Are any problems that you see or needs that feel like need to be met that your work and you specifically address?
There
So
are a lot of problems.
question. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, there are a lot of problems that that I can see, many of which maybe my work isn't actually going to touch.
Yeah, right,
Um,
right.
but I am convinced that that first and foremost, I am convinced that as people better understand their Old Testaments or their Hebrew Bibles, that's going to lead to generally better outcomes. I think that in general is
Yeah.
sort of a core commitment for me, in terms of theologically, in terms of general understanding. So, I mean, that's a pretty big category. Now, I'm only scratching the surface of a few what I think are foundational pieces of that, but there's dozens of others that other people are touching on. I mean, I mentioned the Bible Project folks, and you look at Tim Mackey and those folks there, focusing on the importance of the earliest chapters of Genesis and how those chapters set the table for everything that comes after. I think that's something that's really important, and is fortunately, I think, getting a lot of attention right now. There's I think better understanding the relationship between, say, Revelation and the Gospels is another thing that I would like to see
Yeah.
more of.
Okay.
There's yeah,
Yeah.
I could go on. I
That's
could go
great.
on for
Sure.
hours on some of the things that I think need to be addressed. But
Hey, friends, thank you for listening to this conversation with Dr. Jason Staples. As you could tell along the way, we had some hiccups, technical difficulties. Thank you for being patient with us. Sorry that happened, and I was able to reconnect and pray with Dr. Staples at the end, and we kind of closed out our conversation, but we did have some connection issues. So I apologize for that. Thank you so much. Please leave us any questions, comments on social media, or via email. So love you guys. Thank you so much for your support. Thank you for listening to Storm the Gates. We hope you are blessed by this conversation. We hope that you like us, follow it, subscribe, share it around. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and other platforms, the social media platforms as well. You can ask us questions and ask us to maybe have a conversation, a topic, a conversation partner that we haven't had before. We'd love to engage with you. You can find us online at stgpod.com. You can email us at stgpod@midtexasgmc.org, as we hope this is a podcast that celebrates the glory of God, His goodness, all the work that He's doing in the Mid-Texas Conference of the Global Methodist Church and beyond in the kingdom of God. Remember, friends, the gates of hell will not prevail against the church. Storm the gates. But all that's to say, I'm a Baylor Bear. I'm actually doing a program, a doctorate of ministry program right now. And Lagway came from Florida, has lineage, who was Florida's quarterback.
Yep.
And so I don't know if you got to see him much or have any thoughts about.
Yeah,
how he might
DJ's
fare.
interesting. DJ's interesting because he, to date, has been one of those guys where he will make unbelievable throws that will wow you. And he can do things that very few quarterbacks in the country can do. But the inconsistency to date has been absolutely infuriating. And if you watch him, I broke down a decent amount of his film last year, and a couple things. One is that he was very poorly coached at Florida. His footwork was very poor. His eyes were often in the wrong spots. He would make throws where he was totally disconnected, upper and lower body.
Okay.
And just there were a lot of really, concerning sorts of things that you would see in terms of what he was being coached to do or was not being coached not to do, put it that way.
Yeah.
And that showed up in some of the misses that he had, where it's like, oh, well, the reason he missed that was pretty plain. And then some of the turnovers that he had were absolutely the result of that sort of thing. So my take is that if DJ buckles down and gets excellent coaching at the quarterback position, the potential is really high. Like he could be an all-conference type quarterback right away. If you're talking about getting everything to where there's some quarterbacks who are over mechanical. Right?
Yeah.
Who just,
for sure.
everything is.
Yeah. Totally. Yes.
He's kind of the opposite.
Okay.
Where I would love to see him get about 70% more mechanical and just play within the, all I want from you, DJ, is to play within the confines of what I'm asking you to do. So I want you to drop. I want you to, your eyes need to be here and here. And if there's nothing there, I want you to throw that football into the stands.
Okay.
Simple as that. And if you can get him to play within the script, then you're looking at a guy that can do a ton. Because then once he gets to where he's playing on time and he's getting the ball out and his feet are lining up with his reads and all that, the arm talent is really good.
Okay.
So
I'm excited. Spavital
he can run.
Had some quarterbacks,
and he can run. So, it would be utterly unsurprising to me with him and Spavital to be able to put together an all Big 12 type season. It would not be surprising. It would also not be surprising. It would not be surprising to see him lead the conference in turnovers.
Okay.
So there's your delta. It really boils down to whether or not they're able to get into his psyche, into his way of doing things, to where he's playing like a well-coached quarterback. And a lot of times it's hard to know because some guys are recoverable. Yeah. Some guys, you get this far in their career and they're just, it's never going to change. No matter what coaching you give them from now, it's just never going to change. So is he closer to a Carson Palmer?
Oh.
Or is he closer to, your laundry list of top quarterback recruits who couldn't get it done, and Xavier Lee or somebody like that? Xavier Lee gets Jimbo Fisher, things start to look fine, and then it all falls apart because Xavier just didn't listen, and he was more
I see.
interested in the party scene and so on. Whereas Carson Palmer had 4 offensive coordinators in his 4 years at USC. And it was finally his 4th year where he got a really good one who was able to get him buckled down, and he wins the Heisman and becomes the first overall pick.
Yeah.
And, people didn't see that coming because, well, each year he's doing a new offense, and then year 4, all of a sudden it clicks and the coaching comes in and he becomes an NFL starter. So DJ has that capacity. It's just, is he going to be that, or is he just going to, continue to be what he's been?
Yeah. All right. Well, you've given me enough hope.